All right, let's dive into this long COVID thing. There's this article from Science by researchers Ziad Alalai and Eric Topol, just came out in February. And it really takes us deeper into, beyond just like, oh, a few lingering symptoms, into some really fascinating and, to be honest, concerning stuff about what long COVID really is and what it could mean for all of us.
Yeah, what struck me was how they emphasized that long COVID's a multi-systemic disease. It's not just in your lungs. It hits pretty much every organ system.
Whoa, that's kind of scary when you put it that way. And they don't downplay the numbers either. We're talking millions worldwide dealing with this, so what exactly is long COVID?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. It's not one single thing, really. It's more like a catch-all term for a whole bunch of long-term effects, like after the initial infection.
Yeah.
Almost like a puzzle with lots of missing pieces. And depending on how those pieces fit together, the causes and treatments might be different.
Oh, so like two people could have some of the same symptoms, but actually be dealing with different subtypes of long COVID.
Exactly. It's a real challenge for diagnosis and treatment. And get this, over 90% of long COVID cases are people who had, mild COVID-19.
Wow. So anyone thinking, oh, I had a mild case, I'm good, might want to think again.
Yeah, this article really busts that myth. Your age, race, pre-existing conditions, none of that seems to totally predict who gets long COVID.
So anyone listening thinking this doesn't apply to them, this research says otherwise?
It really could happen to anyone.
Okay, wow. And I imagine the symptoms are all over the place, too.
Oh, yeah. As diverse as the causes, you could say. Brain fog, fatigue. More serious things like dysautonomia, which messes with your nervous system's ability to regulate stuff, like heart rate and digestion.
Right. And then there's a post-exertional malaise, right? That one sounds just awful.
Oh, it can be debilitating. Imagine doing everyday things like just walking upstairs or focusing on work, and it triggers this wave of exhaustion and other symptoms that can last for hours, even days. It's like your body just can't keep up.
Oh, man. That sounds so disruptive.
It really is.
And then, on top of all that, there's the potential for heart problems and metabolic issues.
Yeah, that adds another layer of concern for sure.
So we're seeing how widespread and complex this is. But why is this happening? What are the main theories out there?
Well, one that's pretty fascinating, if a bit creepy, is that the virus itself, or pieces of it, might actually be sticking around in your tissues, even after the initial infection's gone.
Like a really bad house guest.
Uh-huh. Yeah, this viral persistent theory is one of the more unsettling possibilities, for sure.
Yeah, I can see why. So if it's still there, it could be causing more inflammation and damage.
That's the thought. Another big one centers on the immune system. Could that initial infection be sending the immune system into overdrive, causing it to attack the body's own tissues, even after the virus is gone?
Like an autoimmune response.
Exactly. And there's also a chance that COVID-19 might be waking up other viruses that were already there, but dormant, like Epstein-Barr, which causes mono.
It's almost like COVID is waking up sleeping giants inside us.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea.
That would explain why the symptoms are so varied, right?
It would. It's a really intriguing, though obviously concerning, area of research.
For sure. What else are scientists looking into?
Well, one that caught my eye was the potential role of mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mitochondria, those are like the powerhouses of our cells, right? The energy generators.
That's right. And if they're not working right, it could explain the fatigue and weakness so many long COVID patients have.
It's like their cells are running on empty.
Yeah, a great analogy. And then, of course, there's inflammation. Seems to play a big role, especially in blood vessels and the nervous system, which really reinforces the idea that this is more than just a respiratory thing.
Yeah, everything's connected, right?
It really is.
What about the gut microbiome?
Oh, right, that community of bacteria in our intestines. There's more and more evidence that disruptions there could be playing a part in long COVID symptoms, too.
Wow, so much of this is still such a mystery.
It really is, and that's why research is so important.
Speaking of research, what about prevention? What can people do to lower their risk?
Well, the good news is vaccines are super effective. Some studies show they reduce the risk of long COVID by as much as 75%.
That's huge. So getting vaccinated and boosted is still the best defense.
Absolutely. But the article points out something worrying. Booster rates have been dropping.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Like, people are less worried about getting them now.
Right, so we need to get the message out there about the long-term benefits of vaccination, including, reducing long COVID risk.
Like, protect yourself now and in the future.
Like that.
Kitschy.
And besides vaccines, there's some evidence that antivirals, like Paxlovid, might also help lower the risk if you take them early on when you get infected.
So early intervention's key.
Seems like it. There's even a study about metformin. That's a common diabetes drug, and that might offer some protection against long COVID.
Interesting. Could that mean we might be able to use existing meds to prevent long COVID?
It's a really promising area for more research. But for now, the focus should be on getting vaccinated and getting treatment quickly if you do get infected.
Got it. Sounds like we have some tools, but we definitely need more research to really nail down these findings and look for other ways to prevent long COVID.
I agree. And we can't forget about reinfections either. Even with prevention efforts, there's still a concern.
Right, of course. The article makes it clear that every reinfection, even a mild one, can increase your risk of developing or worsening long COVID.
Yeah, and with new variants popping up all the time, it's a constantly changing landscape. So more research is needed there too, to see how different variants affect long COVID risk.
So basically, we can't let our guard down. Masking, ventilation, all the stuff we've learned still matters.
I'd say so. Preventing reinfection is key to minimizing those long-term risks from COVID.
All right, well, lots to think about here. And unfortunately, it's not all good news. This article also highlights some big challenges and gaps in care for people who already have long COVID.
Yeah, that's where it gets really tough, and definitely something we need to talk about.
For sure. We'll be right back to dig into those challenges and talk about what needs to change to better support people struggling with this often invisible illness. Stay tuned.
So we were talking about the gaps in care for people dealing with long COVID.
Yeah.
The article doesn't sugarcoat it. It seems like there's a lot that needs to be done.
It's really disheartening, honestly. You know, one of the worst things is the skepticism some patients face from healthcare providers. It's like their pain isn't being taken seriously.
Yeah, like they're not being believed.
And their symptoms are just brushed off as psychological.
It's almost like they're being gaslighted.
Yeah.
By the very people they're going to for help.
Exactly. Attributing real physical symptoms to just mental or emotional causes. It's not only unscientific, but it's incredibly harmful. It just adds to the stigma and prevents people from getting the care they need. Right. And the article also mentions the limited access to specialized clinics, especially in, lower income countries. So you have all these people struggling with this debilitating condition. But the resources just aren't there.
It's a huge problem, and it needs to be addressed, like yesterday. We need a better system, something more coordinated and comprehensive that recognizes how complex long COVID is and gives patients the support they need.
Makes sense. And then on top of that, the article talks about how clinical trial design is still lagging behind, which slows everything down, right? It's like we're always trying to catch up.
The authors really push for more investment in research. They say we need to develop better animal models to really study what's going on and explore potential treatments.
Yeah, that seems important.
They also talk about using AI to find biomarkers. That could help us diagnose and classify long COVID subtypes.
So instead of looking for one specific cause, we need to look at the bigger picture.
Right. AI could be huge for that. It can analyze tons of data, find patterns, maybe even identify things we've missed with traditional methods.
Like a super detective for long COVID.
Exactly. It could really speed up our understanding and lead to better, more targeted treatments.
Okay, that's encouraging. But the article also brings up a pretty disturbing trend: long COVID denialism.
Yeah, that's dangerous. We can't just ignore it. Again, blaming symptoms on psychological causes is just wrong on so many levels.
The article is very clear about that. We need to stick to the facts and base our understanding on evidence.
And we have to be careful not to mix up long COVID with potential side effects from vaccines. Vaccines are incredibly safe and effective. But like any medical intervention, there can be side effects. That's separate from long COVID, though.
So a nuanced approach is important.
Absolutely. We need to acknowledge the complexity without minimizing the real suffering of patients.
Agreed. And it's interesting, the article puts long COVID into a wider context, talking about other illnesses that can be triggered by infection.
Oh, right. They mention things like influenza, Epstein-Barr, even Ebola, all linked to long-term health problems.
Wow, so long COVID isn't unique in that way.
It's not. And it makes you wonder, are we focusing too much on the initial infection and not enough on the potential long-term effects?
Like we're not thinking far enough ahead.
It's a valid point.
They argue for a bigger research effort.
Yeah.
To figure out how these infections cause chronic illness. It's not just about surviving the initial infection, but what happens after.
Exactly.
Especially when we're thinking about pandemic preparedness, right?
Absolutely. If we can learn from long COVID, we'll be better prepared for future outbreaks and maybe prevent some of these long-term health issues.
It's like a long game, not just the immediate crisis.
I like that, the long game.
So what do they suggest we do? Any concrete steps?
Well, they call for a lot more funding for research, specifically to understand how long COVID works and to develop treatments.
More support for science. Can't argue with that.
They also want to see stronger prevention efforts, like promoting vaccination, improving indoor air quality, and encouraging mask use in high-risk settings.
So basically doubling down on what we already know works.
Yeah, pretty much it.
Anything else?
They also talk about redesigning our data systems to better track the long-term consequences of infections.
Because right now, we're not really seeing the full picture.
Not really. And I think most importantly, they emphasize the need to address the care needs of people with long COVID. That means expanding access to specialized clinics and training healthcare providers so they can recognize and manage the condition.
So giving people the support they need to navigate this really challenging experience.
Exactly. And that support has to be based on empathy and understanding and a commitment to evidence-based care.
Well said. We'll be back in a bit for the final part of our discussion. We'll be diving into some of the thought-provoking questions raised by this article and exploring the long-term implications of long COVID for all of us. Stay tuned. Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive on long COVID, this article really has me thinking, not just about, the impact it's having now, but the possible long-term stuff. That's pretty worrying.
Yeah, one thing that stuck with me was the idea of delayed onset of symptoms. Like, what if they don't show up right away? They compare it to other infections, like the 1918 flu pandemic, polio, where people developed serious health problems years, even decades later.
It's like a ticking time bomb. What if we're just seeing the beginning, and the real impact of long COVID won't be clear for years to come?
That's a scary thought, for sure. And it means we can't just sit around and wait. We need to be proactive, monitoring people who've had COVID, looking for any signs of problems down the line.
So it's not just about now, it's about the future, too, for individuals and for healthcare systems.
Exactly.
And this long-term view should change how we think about pandemic preparedness, too, right?
It should. We need to go beyond just dealing with the immediate threat and think about how to minimize long-term consequences.
Like a whole new way of thinking about public health.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive, though, to be honest, a bit unsettling, too. I started with a lot of questions. We've answered some, but it feels like we've also uncovered even more along the way.
That's how science works sometimes. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
Makes sense. I guess the main takeaway is that long COVID is complex and it's changing, and we can't ignore it.
Absolutely. And we can't dismiss what people are going through.
We'll be sure to link to the full article by Alili and Topol so everyone can read it themselves. But in the meantime, stay curious, stay informed, and take care of yourself.